Okay, so we're going to get started, and today you got two handouts, a little different. You got both the exercise that we're going to work on today, 106, which we'll talk about in depth in a little bit, but you also got your assignment 102, which is your next Photoshop assignment. So the first one was about creating the best photo you could possibly take. This one is about combining two photos and bending reality, making something happen that can't really happen. And so we'll talk at length about this next class. I'll actually show a bunch of examples and talk about what makes a successful combination of images. A lot of what makes a successful combination is the lighting conditions in the two images and making sure that the light matches up. And so I'll talk about that at length next class. It is due on Wednesday, the 21st of February, which is the Wednesday after President's Weekend. So President's Weekend, you have Monday off. You'll come back and have school on Tuesday. You won't see me. And then on Wednesday is when this is due. That means that it's a little bit further off. So like the last one, you had a week to do it. This one, you have a week and a half to do it or so. The reason I give it to you today is so that you can kind of be thinking about it in the back of your mind. It usually takes a while to come up with what the best idea is. So think about it in the back of your mind. I'll show you a bunch of examples on Monday to get you ready for it. And we'll talk about the mechanics of it. You currently don't really have the skills, in all likelihood, to do it. So don't stress out this weekend and try to do it, because you'll learn a bunch more next class in terms of how to do it. So today we're going to talk about two different things. I already talked a little bit about high dynamic range in the introduction to photography lesson. But we'll talk about high dynamic range, and we'll also talk about panoramic photography. Both of which I think are really fun, and it shows a lot of what Photoshop can do. We will also today learn about masks in Photoshop and what masks do. So we'll go through that kind of in the demo portion, but we've got a lot of slides to get through before we get to that point. So we'll start first with high dynamic range photography, or HDR photography. And if you do a Google search for HDR photography, you'll see a bunch. There's a lot of this online. It's a hobby of a lot of people. But essentially, what high dynamic range means is the set of techniques that allow a greater dynamic range in your image. It's basically of the light that's in your image. And what happens is if we were to expose a scene, so let's say we're in this room here, and I was taking a picture, and I took a picture inside this room, and I wanted to see all your faces. So I was standing here, and I took that picture. I could properly expose it so that I'd see every one of your faces. That's not a problem. But outside, it would be way too bright. So we'd end up with the image where all of you are exposed and the windows would be just white. And you've probably taken this image before. Alternatively, I could shoot out the window and get that exposed correctly and see the way we see it now. And all of you would be way too dark. So the idea of a high dynamic range image is how do we bridge the gap between those two images? And really, the reason that we would be doing in the first place is because this is how we see the world. We see the world in high dynamic range. So it's a combination. Did I skip a slide? Yeah. It's a combination of three images from a mechanical standpoint. In this example here, we have the dark image, we have the medium image, and we have the light image. The camera, in this case, is thinking that the medium image is the correct exposure. And we're deliberately underexposing and overexposing. The overexposed gets the dark areas of the image. The underexposed brings down the colors in the light area of the image. And we end up with this as an end result. So we talked a little bit about this before, where you go out and you take a picture of a sunset. And when you take that picture of the sunset and you look at it afterward, like it doesn't look like the sunset. Like it's not as beautiful as it was in person. And that's because our eyes see the world differently than a camera lens does. And the reason that our eyes see the world differently is because behind our eyes we have our brain. And our brain processes this stuff really, really fast. And the older you get, the slower your eyes get at adjusting. But that's kind of a side topic, right? So if I was standing in this room and I was looking at each and every one of you, I would see you perfectly fine. And then all of a sudden I looked outside and I'd see outside just fine. Our brains are so fast at processing what we're seeing that we're seeing in high dynamic range. So we're seeing the shadows, we immediately look outside, we see everything outside just fine. So unlike a camera, which is a fixed, just one exposure, we can constantly adjust and change. So why do we do this? From an artistic standpoint, we more accurately represent the wide range of light in a particular scene. We see the sunset, and we see the shadows. We see the detail in the shadows, but we also see the beautiful sky. In a photo, we don't get both of those at the same time, so we have to find a way to do that. We're mimicking how we see the world. From a rendering standpoint, there's another purpose. And so those of you that were in my 136, and those of you that are going to go to my 136, hopefully, we talk a lot about HDR images and your HDR background. You guys remember that? Right? Load your HDRI. From a rendering standpoint, we can use this same technique to essentially create a background image that is adjustable based on the exposure of the rendering. So we put an image in that contains all this different information in it, and when you go to do the render, the computer calculates what the sky should look like based on what the settings are for the rendering. So it can adjust based on this image. So there is a purpose outside of just making a pretty image, making that picture of the sunset look the way you want it to. Tone mapping is the technique that essentially allows us to, on a low dynamic range device, i.e. a printed photo, the computer screen, your iPad, see this nice image. And what we're doing is we're controlling contrast between neighboring pixels. So we retain that contrast, but across the whole image, instead of having a dark area, the darker area gets a little bit lighter. The lighter area gets a little bit darker. So we can still see the detail, but we're compensating. It can be applied to produce images that look realistic. This is what we actually saw, or it can be exaggerated into the very artistic or painterly. And I'll show you examples of both as we go forward. This tone mapping process essentially reduces the dynamic range or the contrast ratio of the entire image while retaining localized contrast. So we can see detail in the dark areas, we can see detail in the light areas. We're not getting an area that's completely blown out. So my example where I was standing in that corner of the room looking at you guys and then I look outside, instead of having outside being completely white, I can see what's happening outside because I'm retaining the contrast outside just like I'm retaining it inside. So we've got a couple software choices for this tone mapping process. No surprise, one of them is Photoshop. Right? That's what we're doing in this class. So it's not a surprise that I would introduce this as a Photoshop example here. There is an automated Photoshop action that does this for us. It used to be a lot harder to do it. Now it's pretty easy. Essentially, we can merge to HDR, and we tell it what images we want to apply the HDR to, and it'll do it for us. It's pretty easy. Post-processing, though, is necessary to get the really good results. We're going to do some curves adjustment today. We're also going to selectively apply a curves adjustment to just part of the image. So we're going to start to control a little bit more about the image. There is no built-in automated tone mapping. It's okay. You'll see it a little bit, but it's not truly an automated solution. Of course, it's available here, so you guys can use it. The other option, there's not too many good ones that are out there, is a software called Photomerge, and they build a plugin for Photoshop, Lightroom. They used to build it for Aperture, and it's also a standalone application. So if you really like high dynamic range imagery and you want to shoot a bunch of them and you want to do a bunch of processing, this is really the gold standard application. It does just this, and it does it really well. The nice thing is it's almost an automated process. It knows what the presets are. It kind of knows how to get you the desired results. So it's pretty easy to work with. Unfortunately, it's not on the lab computer, so you guys don't get to try it out. But I believe that there is a student version. So if you get really excited about it and want to do it, at least I want to bring it up. So let's look at some realistic examples of where this is used in practice. So I think this is a really good place to start. We've got two images here. The one on top is the non-high dynamic range image. So let's say that you were searching online for an office space, and you wanted to rent a space, and you were looking through pictures, and you saw the image on top. Okay, it's a nice space, right? I could see my company working there, but I wonder what I'm looking at. It's not selling the space so much. The picture on the bottom, however, down here, if we look at this, we get the sense of what's happening in this space. We get more detail in the shadows of the image, like what's on the ceiling, what do the ceiling tiles look like, etc. but we also get what's happening outside of all these windows. What's my view going to look like? So this image down here is selling. It's not that different. It's not exaggerated. It's not artistic. But it's selling what this space really is. So it's a perfect example of how a high dynamic range image can end up being valuable in your everyday life. So just by doing it this way, we have a sense of what's the city, what's the space. It's a whole lot better than the top image. Another example's here. On the left, we have our standard. On the right, we have our high dynamic range. Look at the image on the bottom, for example. You gravitate naturally toward the high dynamic range image. It's a lot better as an image. So we're trying to do these sorts of things. I want you to have this skill set so that you can present your work in the best possible scenario. You can showcase what it is that you're trying to showcase. Sometimes at night, when you need a little bit more exposure, this can help too. There's an example. Sometimes an image, this looks like a normal image. Doesn't look too different. The differences are in the shadows. We still get a lot of detail in the shadows where otherwise we'd be losing that detail. The borderline image, the dusk image, we get a lot more detail in what's happening. The lights in the building aren't just blown out white squares. Likewise, we get a lot of the landscape is not just big dark shadows as we were trying to expose it. If we were trying to expose the scene and not use a high dynamic range image, we'd either get the light in the tower and the ground would be really dark, or vice versa. Another example here where we're getting a little bit more contrast in the sky. We're showing all of those clouds, but we're also seeing what's happening in the shadows of the building, the detail of those shadows. So here presents one of the other challenges with high dynamic range image. So this is certainly, it's a nice image. But in this particular image, there's a lot of things that move over the course of those 3 exposures. Remember, a high dynamic range is 3, 5, or 7 exposures that are then combined together. So if you imagine standing here taking those 3 pictures, no matter how fast you can press your camera shutter, there's a delay between each image. So something like this car right down here moves as you take those 3 images. So you end up with a ghosted bumper right there where you've got a couple license plates. Likewise, if you look over at the people, right, like that person, there's a couple versions of that person. So you just have to be aware that this is a problem with a high dynamic range image. There's a lag in what happens, and you're going to get these ghosted shapes whenever something is moving. So you'll see high dynamic range used more often, not in a busy scene like this, because it's hard to. Could we heal this after the fact in Photoshop? Could we erase that kind of thing? Could we clone stamp over it? Sure, but it's a lot of extra post-processing. Giving us a little bit more detail in the shadows on that shot. So I'm flipping through these a little bit faster because you're starting to get a sense for what these are doing. So let me jump back here. This obviously has a lot of movement in it. It's okay though, because the effect that they were after was the movement becoming blurred. So in this context, it's not a problem. You just want to be conscious about, do you want this effect or do you not want this effect? I got really excited about taking pictures of sunsets, so I've got lots of these. But I won't make you look at all of them, I promise. So then let's move. Those are the ones that look like we see the world. Those are the realistic examples. Then we can move into the creative examples, or the almost painterly examples. And this is also, it could be a desired effect, but it also could be the danger of high dynamic ranges. You can push it too far, and you want to be aware of what that boundary is. So something like this in San Francisco, this is starting to be almost misty. It's ethereal. It's different than what the scene really looked like. And so you have to be aware of that happening over time. Something like this, I think it's really effective. It looks like a great haunted house. My kids would love this. They would think this is fantastic, especially in the sky. I mean, was the sky really that dark? Probably not. So they're pushing the boundaries in this image beyond what was really happening. And it doesn't mean that it's a bad image. It's a really nice image. You just have to be aware of, when you're doing that processing, how far are you pushing it, and is it reaching your desired intent for the particular image. This example, the sky is kind of over-processed. We end up with this painterly view. It's still a gorgeous image. So I'm not critiquing that part of it. I'm just pointing out that you can push the boundary of this a bit too far. This example here, I think, does go too far. So we look at the, Golden Gate Bridge. Unless it was like nuclear war or something, I don't think the sky would look like this. I think it's a little bit too extreme. So did this push the boundary a little far? Probably. Probably. And so you want to be aware when you do this post-processing of what your desired intent really is. So here's an example of a high dynamic range panoramic photo. So we'll talk about panoramic photos in just a second. That's why everything is curved in this scene, because it's designed to be 360. If I took the left end and curled it around to the right end, they would meet. If I took the bottom and pinched it all together, it would meet top. So basically, it's the inside of a sphere. In this particular image, like the boards on the deck are a little bit too much. I doubt the sky really looked like that. So you're getting the idea. So let's move from high dynamic range into panoramic photography. And the HDRI backgrounds that I was talking about, they are panoramas. So it's kind of, they work closely together. Essentially, a panorama is a large, wide field of view. So we're taking more to a particular scene than you would normally see. A normal camera exposure, we're extending that out. A 360 panorama is a full 360-degree view of something. So you're capturing all the way around. Ideally, you're capturing all the way vertically, too. So panoramic photography generally involves stitching multiple images together to give you this really wide angle of a particular scene. And that wide angle could wrap all the way around behind you if you wanted it to. Even when, like, we all have our phones and we get out and we go into panorama mode and we do this, right? That is essentially your camera's just on the fly stitching multiple images together. Okay? So this idea of stitching images is not a new thing. We need a wider angle of view. We need to be able to stitch images together. So there's a few mechanics relating to panoramic photography. And I think this is one of the things that nobody gets education in. So the default is you pick up your phone, right, and you do this. Okay? The problem is you can end up with some errors in your results. The right answer is to put your phone in one place and you move around your phone instead. Okay? So we'll talk about why. What we want to do is we want to isolate something called the nodal point of the camera lens. And this, just like your eye, is when the image comes into your iris, the image flips before it hits the back of the camera. That's the way the lens works. And we've all gotten used to that, and we see the world right side up. Hey, did you guys ever hear about the experiment where they put mirrors on somebody's glasses and flipped the world upside down, and took them only 24 hours for the brain to correct it? It's pretty cool. And then, of course, you take the glasses off and you're screwed again. But anyway, it's pretty neat. That's a side note. But what we want to do is, just like our eyes, we want to isolate where that point is in the camera lens where it flips. And if we can do that, we want to rotate around that particular point. And by doing that, we're going to eliminate something called parallax, which should also be termed Google Street View errors. We could just say that they're the same thing, okay? Because you've all seen this. You want to move your body around the camera rather than moving the camera around your body. So it all needs to focus on that nodal point. So here's a couple examples. And it's always hard to kind of see this. In this example here, the image that we're shooting is down here at the bottom. So that's the end result of the image. This is a top view. looking down on the camera. So if I were to set this same thing up in this room, right, it would be the same as if I had two objects that were in a line. So here I have this pole that's standing there, and there's a white cube on the back table. So if I were to take this image, right centered on it, okay, no problem, I'd have this, and I get this end result where I have the box and I have the piece behind it perfectly in line. If I didn't rotate around the nodal point, okay, then when I move this way, and you can actually see this happen, right, when the front object moves away from the rear object. They're no longer in a line anymore. If, however, I move around the nodal point of the object, right, where I go like this, when I do that, these two objects stay in alignment. So instead of having objects that don't stitch together, those objects are always going to stitch together. So there's examples right there of parallax. So like I said, this is the Google Street View errors. You've all seen these when you're looking at Street View. Buildings don't quite line up. It's because of these parallax problems. So in this case, it's the power pole lines don't line up. Another example here on the side of whatever this roof line is, those two lines don't quite match up. So we can eliminate, here's a particularly extreme example where you can see different images as you go through not lining up. We can eliminate that by figuring out where that point is on our camera and working around that. So the same thing when you do it with your phone, just move your body, keeping your phone in the same place. Camera is the same thing. Keep the camera in the same place, move your body around the camera. So what are our final results? We can create unrolled panoramic images, which are fun in their own right, but they don't really accurately represent the scene because straight objects are curved and curved objects are straight. Or we can create virtual reality images or movies. And this is starting to become far more prevalent now. And I think it'll probably be the next big thing that takes off. It's an interactive movie or scene where you can actually choose where to look, essentially. Depending on where you look, your scene changes. Software. Photoshop, no surprise, right? So today, obviously, we're working in Photoshop, so I'm going to teach you how to stitch images together in Photoshop. It's really, really good at small groups of images. So throw 10 images at it, it'll do great. Throw a full 360 panorama with 50 or 60 images at it, doesn't really like that very much. So it's good for small groups of images. It's completely automated, so all you have to do is sit back and let it go, which is nice. But it is difficult to stitch the full panorama. If you want to stitch the full 360, both vertically and horizontally, it's a little bit on the challenging side. So there's a couple other options. PT GUI is one. This is built on a code base called Pano Tools. There's a free version of this that I'll concentrate a little bit more on because free as a student is always a good thing. So if you're interested in learning how to stitch panoramas together using a little bit more sophisticated piece of software, Huggin is the one to go to. It basically will run through an automated process, but then you can go in and correct visually, saying this point on this image matches this point on that image, and it'll warp the images independently to get them to seam together. It's pretty cool. It was supposed to be installed on lab computers. Ignore that part of the slide because it wasn't installed, so we don't get to play around with it. It is what it is. But it's free, so if you want to do it at home, by all means, give it a shot. There is our standard phone panoramas. Google Street View, the app, which is obviously on Android but also on iOS, does an awfully good job at taking multiple images and stitching them together. I don't know, have you guys played with it before? No, a little bit. It's pretty fun. It's pretty good. It works best if you're outside. If you try to do it inside, you're going to get a lot of weird parallax errors because your phone's moving. Even if you try to move it around, it's a little iffy. But it works a lot better outside. It's kind of funny. I was in Hawaii probably, I don't know, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, something like that. And I was on the beach, and I was like, I was, teaching the class, and I'm like, I'm going to try this thing out. And I shot a panorama on the beach in Kauai, whatever. And I uploaded it to Google. Sure, why not? I checked the box or whatever. I got a notification last year that it has like 50,000 views. I was like, what? So it's kind of funny when you do this kind of street view stuff. If you're submitting it to their public map, it's exposed to a lot of people. So do be aware if you're uploading it. But it's pretty easy to work with. and pretty fun. If you want to mess around with it, go for it. It's pretty good. And then the next big thing is VR or 360 video. And this was something that actually I spent a lot of time researching and thinking about when I was in grad school 10 years ago, where the technology just wasn't there yet. And we were playing around with it, and I did some different scenarios, and I actually shot some 3D video and as part of my thesis. But the technology wasn't there. There was no way to really embrace it. Now we have the technology. So you can use your phone. The sensors in your phone allow you to interactively watch something. And I could see this really taking off as a concept. The idea that you as the viewer in a particular scene or a particular movie can choose what it is you're watching. And you're far more immersed in what's happening than just watching it in a single plane. So I think it's going that direction. Obviously, if you're going to shoot this, you need a specialized set of cameras or an array of cameras that are designed to do this and stitch the images together afterward. So let's look at some examples. These are all unrolled examples, so they're not the VR examples. I have a few interactive ones that we can look at online. This was processed in something called Stitcher, which Autodesk bought and then killed off. So you don't get to use that anymore. It's a really cool piece of software. This is a good image, though, because one of the things you have to pay attention to when you're shooting panoramic images is making sure your exposure is locked. And you want to make sure that exposure stays the same, because if you suddenly have a dark image or you have an exposure that doesn't match, when you go to do the final stitch, you'll end up with these kinds of artifacts where something doesn't match up. It's light versus dark. Not that something you couldn't do a little clone stamp and heal that up in Photoshop, but it's a good example of the kinds of things that can happen. The scalloped edges on the top and the bottom of this image are just because I didn't go all the way up when I shot the set or all the way down. So it was just straight across the center, and you end up with these little scalloped edges. Each one of those scalloped edges is essentially a straight photo that's been bent during the unroll process. But you can also see that in a panorama, you're capturing far more of a scene than you could just with a single image. You also have to be careful not to miss an image. So here's an example where I shot this full 360, and I miscounted in the number of images that I was taking, and you end up with the black hole in the upper right corner. So could I go in with Photoshop and fix that? Sure. It's fixable. But it's a whole lot easier if you remember to actually take the image in the first place. But if you're taking 50 or 60 images, it can be hard to keep track. So here's an example. This is in Marai in Peru. And I show this example because one of the things in an unrolled panorama that you have to be aware of is that things that are straight in real life appear to be curved in an unrolled panorama. Things that are curved in real life appear to be straight. So here we have a panorama, and we've got all these straight walls going across it. In reality, it's shot from the center of this. So it's perfectly circular, which is why in the panorama we get straight lines all the way across. So it's one of those things that you have to kind of get used to seeing. So this was in Ollantaytambo, and in this particular example, we're inside this little grain house or storehouse of some kind. And so all the walls that we're seeing that appear curved in this unrolled image are straight. So this was a rectangle when I shot it. The other neat thing about it, and you'll see this is one of the examples image sets that I'm going to give you today to play around with, is that when you stitch this kind of stuff together, because it's made up of so many smaller images that are all high resolution, you actually get a huge amount of detail in one of these. So I could actually zoom in this particular image right in between and see all the detail of what's through that door on the other side of the valley. So you can end up with very high resolution images because you're stitching all of these images together. This image here was in the old Amtrak train station in West Oakland. This image started my love of panoramas and ended up spawning into my thesis. So this, just like with the high dynamic range image, when people move through space, you get the ghosted artifacts of people. So you've got all the artifacts of people walking through this. And this just kind of started the whole thesis process for me, as interesting as that was. Another example here, this is Worcester Hall in Berkeley, the architecture building. I didn't do the exposure correctly, so we end up with those artifact lines. It's not too big of a deal in the sky. I could fix that. But on the building, where it slices through the building, that's a problem. So you have to make sure you lock that exposure. The night version, however, works just fine. The exposures were correct. And in all honesty, if you move on to Berkeley, this is the time that you're going to spend there. Right? This tower, the building tower, you guys been to Berkeley before? You aware of the architecture building? So in the architecture building, each floor are where all the studios are. And so you have a desk, you're assigned for the semester, and you work at that particular desk all semester. And so it's really entertaining every time you go into Berkeley to see the studio floors, because you can tell who's working in studio based on which floor has the lights on. They all have sensors, so if people aren't there, the lights go off. So if generally the landscape people are on the second and third floor, the city planners are on the third and fourth floor ish, and then the architecture people go up from there. And generally speaking, thesis is always on the ninth floor, so those are the oldest people are up on the very top. So if you go there at night, 5 o'clock rolls around and the landscape people lights go off, right? 6 rolls around, the city planning, the lights go off. So everything's off in the bottom of the tower, and slowly throughout the night, the lights go off. That top floor, lights never go off. So just like I said, with the high dynamic range image, you can end up with ghosted artifacts. And so in this particular example, this was when we were, this is me and a friend when we were in undergrad. So this is 2004. It's when I actually had hair. It's amazing, right? We did this panorama in this little computer lab. Actually, if you look closely, these are like those old white Macs, right? So it's dated, right? But we were taking this panorama and we said, oh, this will be fun. We'll just put ourselves multiple times in the image. So each time we took an image, we put ourselves looking at each other and just goofed around, because this is what you can do with the panorama. Multiple exposures, you stitch them together. You have the same problems when you're stitching things together, where you get the half person. So in this example, we have just the legs of a person, because she walked into the frame when I took the picture, but not in the other pictures. So you have to be aware of those kinds of things, and they can theoretically ruin an image. This is one on the Brooklyn Bridge, where I actually shot this by hand. So I didn't have my tripod, I didn't have my gear to do it, and all I did was make sure that I moved around the camera rather than the camera around me, and I don't have any weird artifacts. It all stitched together really nicely. So it's just something to be aware of. You can shoot it manually and get good results out of it. So I'm going to start flipping through these images a little bit more. You can get creative about how the outputs come together, so they don't have to be that panorama. You can warp what you're seeing. And these were a bunch of images from my thesis, which centered on panoramas and the airport. So I had lots of panoramas. These were drawings. As part of thesis, I had to learn how to draw this kind of a panorama. So it's like, anybody learned how to do two-point perspective, right? You guys maybe learned that at some point. This is like two-point perspective but instead of passing lines straight, you're passing through a curve because it's warping the image. So I ended up having to do the drawing. This is all manually done. It wasn't rendered or anything, but I had to do the drawings on the computer because there were so many different lines to keep track of. This drawing, or this little piece of the drawing, ultimately, a series of them ended up being 21 feet long as part of the thesis drawing. So it was pretty fun. But don't ask what my thesis is about. I don't even remember anymore. It's too long ago. But it was fun to do these kinds of drawings and to create them. So anyway, I wanted to throw that one in there. This was the drawing. This was the end drawing, where I had panoramas leading into other panoramas and whatever. So it ended up being pretty fun, but pure line drawing, no renderings. OK, so we'll take a quick break. We'll come back at 9, and I will show you guys how we're going to stitch all these things together in Photoshop. OK? OK, so we're going to start back up with exercise 106. And when we're working with 106, when you did 103 and you went out and shot your own photos, if you were able to take a bracketed set of photos, use your bracketed set. If you didn't take a bracketed set, or yours didn't turn out, or they won't align properly or whatever, I have some sample sets that are available. So if you go to today's exercise 106, so if you go to exercises spring 2018 and you click on exercise 106, at the bottom I have some samples for you. So there's a zip file, sample group 1, 2, and 3. You can pick any of those, it doesn't matter. There's 3 different sets. Also for the panoramic images, I have sample sets that you guys can pick from there as well. I think I should have double checked this. Yeah, that one doesn't. Well, maybe it hasn't finished loading. I think some of these have the actual, have the interactive panorama so that you can look around and see what the panoramas look like. I don't know that all of them are working. All of these links are working. Yeah, this one's working too. So anyway, you can play around with these and get a sense for what it is that we're stitching together. But the sample groups of images that are used to make them are listed there. So you can pick from those as well. So I already have those downloaded on my flash drive. So if you haven't, you can download those or use your own. It doesn't matter for this. I'm going to go ahead and open up Photoshop to start. Notice that I'm not opening the images. I'm opening Photoshop itself because the process, luckily for us, is an automated one. And essentially to do that, we have to initiate the command first and then tell it what images exist. So I'm going to go to the File menu, and I'm going to go to the Automate menu item, and I'm going to come down to Merge to HDR Pro. And when I click on that, it's going to be asking for where are your high dynamic range files. So what are the ones that you're going to be using? So hopefully you've already downloaded them and put them on your flash drive. So once again, that is under File, Automate, Merge to HDR Pro. We get this dialog box. We're going to use Files. I'm going to click on the Browse button, and I'm going to go find those files that I already have downloaded. So I'll go into today's exercise, and I have several different sets that I'm going to work with. Let me start. I'll start with this sunset group. So I have 1, 2, and 3. Remember, the middle is the correctly exposed. Then we have a deliberately underexposed and a deliberately overexposed. So I'm going to select all 3 by clicking on the first one and holding down the Shift key and clicking on the last one. So I get all 3 there. You could instead hold down the Control key and click on each one. That would work as well. So I have those 3 set. I'm going to go ahead and say OK. And it loads in those 3 images into this little browser here. I want to make sure that I've checked the box for attempt to automatically align source images. So in an ideal world, when I shot these images, I should have had a tripod. I shouldn't have hit the tripod at all. They should be perfectly aligned. When I shot these images, I didn't have a tripod. I shot them back to back to back. They're pretty close, but when you say attempt to automatically align source images, it will attempt to make sure that they line up. So if it needs to move one image a few pixels one way or the other to make them line up, that will help. So there they are, attempt to automatically align source images, and I'll go ahead and click on the OK button. And the cool thing is that essentially Photoshop is doing a bunch of things for me in the background. And you can see in the layer stack over here that it's combining layers and whatever. So once I get to this Merge to HDR Pro dialog, it's attempted to line the source images. We can actually see there is a bit, if I were to zoom in, see that little bit of ghosting on the horizon there? That's the 2 images not quite lining up perfectly. It's still probably reasonable. We can look down here and we can see what my exposure values were. So I have an exposure value of 0, I have an exposure value of minus 1.85, and I have an exposure value of plus 1.74. So where does my brackets come from? From the camera. From the camera. Okay. From the camera. So then I can come up here. Let me press Control 0 so I can see the whole image again.
Artificially change the exposure value?
No. This is in my particular camera. I have a mode on the camera that's called bracketing mode, and so I can specify shoot it 1 f-stop low, 1 f-stop high from where it's supposed to be, and it'll shoot 3 consecutive images. So it's meant, the camera's meant to do it. Some cameras have that feature, some don't.
If you don't, and then you have
you could manually adjust it. Exactly. Exactly. Okay, so now that we've done that, we have this dialog box. And this is essentially where we're doing some of the rough cut tone mapping. So we're doing a few adjustments here. First off, I'm always a big fan of the presets. So if we click on the preset here, we have default, but then you'll see that there's a bunch of other presets that are listed. And so it's not a bad idea to go through and see some of these and see how they turn out. So let me check photorealistic, for example. Okay, that's not too bad. And you'll also see that the sliders here will change based on what this preset is. So saturated gives me a little bit more color. Right? I can go photorealistic high contrast. No, I don't really like that one. I could go to more saturated. Okay, well that's too much. So the point is that you can play around with these as presets. City twilight, no, that's not going to work for me. Surrealistic high contrast. Whoa, right? So the point is that you can play around with the presets and get yourself close. So if you feel like this is close, then you can come down here and adjust some of the other sliders. So for example, under the advanced section here, shadow, this controls the, I believe, the dark areas of the image. So let's see if it, come on, show me something. There we go. So here in the shadows, look down here at the bottom. See if I can you guys see that on the, no, you probably can't see that. Tiny bit. I wonder if I can, it's far more dramatic on, let's see, can you see that on the sky? Yes, you can see it on the sky. Okay, so I'll pick highlight, for example. So I can control just the light areas of the image using this highlight slider to control how bright that part of the image becomes. Likewise, I can adjust this vibrance setting to see how much of the color comes out, which actually makes a big difference. It's not saturation, it's vibrance. So upping that, so I might go back to my photorealistic, and then I might up the vibrance a bit to get to the image that I like. So again, this is by eye, what feels right. So start with the preset and work your way down. In the tutorial that I've written online, I do talk a little bit about using the curves diagram. I think Photoshop has done a better job with the sliders now in their newer versions. So I don't think you have to worry about the curves just yet. And you can work with just the sliders and get pretty good results. When I'm done, I'll go ahead and click OK. And we'll have to give it a little bit of time, and then I get the final result of the image. So it's pretty painless because Photoshop does a lot of the work for us. So let me do that with another set of images just so you can see me do it twice. I'll go to File, and then I'm going to go to Automate, Merge to HDR Pro. I'm going to pick a different set of images this time. I'll pick these, which were on top of Half Dome. I'll go ahead and say OK. Okay, so here I am. I've got my 3 images. My exposure value here, 0.0 is the middle image. Then I get minus 1.99 and plus 2.01. So that was very close to exposure value there. I'm going to go through my presets and decide which one I like best. And maybe it's that one. Remember, I can also adjust the highlights or the shadows. I could darken up those just a little bit to get a little bit more texture out of the rocks. And then I could go ahead and say, OK. Let me up the vibrance here just a bit, too. OK, then I'll say OK. And it does its job, and I end up with the next version of the image. So this part is relatively easy. The next piece that I'm going to introduce you to is we're going to do a levels adjustment, and then I'm going to show you how to make that levels adjustment apply to only part of the image, which is kind of the next big hurdle that you guys need to cross over. So in this particular part of the of this scene, I'm going to work to make the bottom of this image a little bit better. And maybe I'll do something on the sky in a next round. So first off, I'm going to go into my layer. I'll go to New Adjustment Layer. And let me try a levels adjustment first. And I'll go ahead and say OK. There's my levels adjustment. We can brighten up the image just a bit. And I want a little bit more contrast out of the... And let me put it this way. I'm going to exaggerate what I'm doing so that you guys can see it better on the screen. Okay? So let me do it a little bit more like that so I get more contrast in the ground here. I don't like what this levels adjustment did to the upper part of the scene. So up here, it makes it too dark when I turn that on. But I do like what happened down here in the lower part of the scene. So I want this to apply only to this lower section. And to do that, by default, when we create the adjustment layer here, we get the adjustment and then we get this white square that's over in our layer stack. And you guys saw this before. This layer stack is representative of something called a mask in Photoshop. And what the mask does is it's kind of like if you were spray painting on a wall and you put a piece of tape on the wall. Wherever you put the piece of tape on and pulled it off, you wouldn't have spray paint. So we can do the same thing. On this white, right now everything is white, so there's no piece of masking tape on the wall. We're allowing this adjustment to apply to everything. If we want to say don't apply to the upper part of the image, we need to work on this mask. So I'll click on it to make sure it's highlighted. It's got those little white bars around it. And I will then go over to my paintbrush tool, and I'm going to paint with black. So I need my foreground color, the color on top, to be black. And I'll go ahead and paint. I don't want to paint with birds, however. So let me come back over, and I'm going to paint with a hard brush to start so that you guys can see this happen. So I'll go ahead and paint right here. And so you can see that that adjustment is no longer applying to this area that I've painted. Furthermore, you can see over on this mask that I now have this little black area on my mask. So I could work the rest of the way. Let me make my brush a little bit bigger to make this faster. Along my image. Now the top part of the image is all black. The bottom part is white. That's where the adjustment is applying. And if I were to toggle it on and off, you can see that it's only changing the bottom of the image. Let me show you in another example. Maybe this example will be a little bit easier to see. I'm going to use the sunset here for a second. I'm going to go ahead and convert this to black and white. I'll go to New Adjustment Layer, and I'm going to use the Channel Mixer. Not that you would typically do this for a sunset. Black and white sunset kind of defeats the purpose. But it's an easy way. Oops. Sorry, I picked the wrong one. Channel Mixer. There we go. OK, so there's my Channel Mixer. Monochrome. I have to do a few little trials here to find the one that I like. OK, we'll say it's this one. OK, so it's converted this all to black and white now. And on that mask, once again, I have all white. So the adjustment is applying to everything. If I come over to my paintbrush and I paint with black as my color. By the way, if you have a different color in here, you can double click on the square and then choose black. And now wherever I paint won't have this black and white filter applied. So if I were to paint out the sky, for example, the color would come back. So I could come in here and paint just the sky down to the horizon. Like that. Now you see how it's a little bit chunky right at the edge there. And the truth is that to do this right, I really need to zoom in a bit. I need to make my brush a little bit smaller. And I probably need to soften the edge just a bit. So about like that. And then we can come in and paint it right to the edge there. Now the good news about a mask is if you make a mistake, oops, you can go back and instead of painting in black, I can switch my colors to white and I can paint that part back. and then I can switch back and continue. So a mask is not permanent. You're not erasing something. It's just a temporary application. So I would come along here and to wherever the, I think I'm below the horizon. Am I below the horizon? I don't know. Kind of all blends together at this point. There we go. Let me press Control 0 so we can see the whole thing. And now the color part of the image is applying only to the top. So the mask is affecting just the top of the image. Yeah.
So if you don't click the black, you're like yellow or red, what happens?
So if you were to pick a different color, you'd get a gray value.
Oh.
And so gray is semi-transparent.
Okay.
So your adjustment kind of applies. Okay, so I would stick to black and white if you can.
Yeah.
It's usually on or off. So
Sorry.
yeah.
So you have a clean way to get rid of that that overlapping or whatever you call it when you open.
You know, with the artifact that of these two, I could clone stamp it. I mean, I could probably try to work my way through it, but it's not something today we're going to worry about. Okay, so let me come back to this image, for example. This time, maybe I'll use my curves adjustment. Let me go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and let me go to Curves. And curves can be really good because we can selectively do something to the image without worrying about another part of the image. So if I wanted to adjust just the sky, let's say I wanted more blue in the sky, something like that, I could work on my curves, but I didn't like what it was doing to the ground down here. Once I have that adjustment applied on the layer mask, I can come over with my paintbrush with black, make this a little bit bigger, and I can say I only want that to apply to the sky. And I can paint this part out. And just like I would do with the in the last one where I spent a little bit of time at the horizon kind of touching it up, I would do that if I was spending a little bit more time. And now this is only applying to that sky. It's not changing the rest of the image, except for a little bit of the image down here that I missed. There we go. And we can toggle it back and forth and see that it's only changing that part of the image. So I'm selectively choosing where a particular piece of the image applies. I can take this a step further, and this is not something that you have to do in today's class, but I want to try to illustrate the point of masking, in that I could bring in another image. So let's say I didn't like this sky. It didn't have enough cloud in it. I could go find a sky that I liked. So I believe I already have one for this illustration. Let me see here. Yeah, right there. This is the image. It has some clouds in it. I'm going to use that. Let me place that into this scene. So I'll go to File and then Place, and I'll drop that cloud into the scene. I need to make this a little bit bigger, so I'm going to hold down Shift to keep it in proportion. And I want to make sure that those clouds cover my whole horizon. So let's do it about like that. If you're struggling to see through, you could adjust the transparency so that you can make sure you kind of line it up about like that. So I clicked on the image, and right here on the layer, I can adjust the opacity. We'll go back up to 100%. I'll go ahead and commit to it. There it is. Now in this example, remember I already did a mask that's controlling the sky. So all I need to do is copy this mask onto that layer. And I can do that by holding down the Alt key and dragging this mask up to this layer. So I'll drag it up to that layer, and now the clouds are applying to the sky. So I know I make it look really easy. Okay, it's not that easy. It takes a lot of practice to get there. Okay, but I want to show you where these kinds of things are going. Does that make sense? So part of the reason that we spend so much time working on masking is because you guys need to know how to combine things together and to make this guy go with this, or to make this person fit into a scene. we'll actually spend a whole lecture talking about just how do you put things into a scene and make them look like they belong. So this is not the last time that we'll talk about masking by any means. There'll be lots more masking. But today's your introduction to masking. Today's your time to play around with it and see if you can do it. So you don't have to do the cloud example that I just did. But I wanted to show that as an illustration. So what we're working on today is not necessarily what the end result of the image looks like. We're looking for, I combined my images together and I was able to understand how masking worked in a broad stroke. So something like this where I have black and white and part of the image is in color, that's a good understanding of how the mask works. It's a good place to try it. So you can try any one of the adjustment layers. I talk through, I suggest using levels, curves, channel mixer, selective color, the hue and saturation, for example. You could also do this to a layer blending mode. So remember we did blending modes last class. So I could take something like this one. Let me turn everything else off. I could do a layer blending mode. So to do that, I went to my layer, new adjustment layer, and I went to levels. Pinch that down a little bit. Then on that levels, I changed this to be either a multiply, a screen, or an overlay to see what the end result was. And go back to a multiply and see if that works. Do a screen. Let's do a multiply. OK, I like what the multiply did to the ground. I don't like what it did up above. So on this, there's my mask. I'll paint with black the upper part to have that multiply not apply. And I know I'm going a little bit fast on my masks. You should take a little bit longer when you do this. So in this case, my blending mode, this was multiply, has a layer mask such that it's only changing the rocks. So same strategy works for the blending mode that we did last class. So we go through, you can do any of those. You're going to do a simple mask, which is what I've been doing here, to define what areas of the high dynamic range photo has that applied to it. When you're done, I want you to save the Photoshop file. So you go to File and then Save. And you'll save a Photoshop PSD file of whatever this image is. Okay, so you give it a name and save it into today's folder. You will then go back and do a Save for Web. So I'll do File, Save for Web. And on the Save for Web version, make sure the preset is JPEG high, and then make sure you adjust the image size, the larger number, to be 1,000. And then you'll click on Save. That'll be what you'll post for the first part of today's exercise. So that's through the first part. The second part, we're going to talk about stitching your panoramic images together. So to do that, just like with the merge to HDR, this is an automated process. So I would go up to the File menu. I'll go to Automate. And instead of choosing Merge to HDR Pro, the next one down is called Photomerge. That's the one that I'm going to choose. So I'll click on Photomerge. And the dialog box that comes up is similar to the last one. We're going to use, under Layout, we're going to use Auto, though the truth is, depending on how you shot your images, you could pick one of these other examples and you might get better results. I think for our purposes, leaving it on Auto is a good idea. I'm going to go ahead and browse for my images. Just like with the high dynamic range images, I've downloaded the sample sets. I have 3 different ones. I have all 3 of the ones that you're doing. I'm going to pick this first one. And I could select all the images and throw it at Photoshop. I told you the results are never that good. So instead, I'm going to pick a group of images to just do part of it. So let me go through and pick a few. What I'm doing is I'm picking groups that overlap. So I'm making sure that they overlap. And I wrote down the numbers in this batch so that I made sure I picked the right ones. OK, so I've picked that group. I'll say OK. This will have a lot more images in it. So I picked about 12 images here. And now that I have those images, I'm going to look down at the options. So one, I want to blend the images together, yes. If my images had vignetting, which means that the edges of the image are darker than the centers, we could elect to try to remove that if we wanted to. There is also something for geometric distortion correction. Depending on the source images, you may or may not need to check that. My source images for these were shot with my tripod, with my gear, and my rig that isolates the nodal point, so they're good images to begin with. So they should stitch together nicely. You may find in your own group of images that checking that box is helpful. Depends on how the original images were shot. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and say OK. And this can be a slow process in Photoshop, depending on how many images you throw at it. So as we look at what's happening, first off, it's opening the images. And we can watch the layer stack kind of going through it. Now it's going to attempt to align each of the images together. So it's looking for similar features in each image and trying to align those together. And like I said, this can take a while.
So if the photo set I take is not 360, like 180.
Right.
You go through this process. So will they understand it 180 or they try to ditch the two ends?
No, Photoshop doesn't think of it as a 360. It just says, do I have content that I can overlap and align together? So if you have 180, you're fine. Yeah. It has a hard time.
Overlap edges, so for them to align them.
Exactly. You need to make sure that they overlap. Usually the rule of thumb is that they should overlap by about 30%. So a third of your image. That gives enough room to try to stitch them together. All right. So there, Photoshop has done an awfully good job of stitching that group of images together. You'll be able to see on your screen, and you can see it faintly on my screen here, that there are some little lines that show where the images basically were or existed. Those will go away as soon as you output. They're a little bit of a ghosting artifact. But I want to point out something to do with the masks in this part of the image. So let's drill down and look at the first image. So there's just one image. Okay, it's represented here. The whole image is right there. So Photoshop warped the image. It stretched it and tweaked it a bit. But then it also applied a mask to that layer. And that mask is represented here. So instead of that white square, this square is mostly black with just a little bit of white. And when it did that mask, it lined it up such that the next image became a seamless transition. So the mask of one matches up with the mask of the other. Do you guys see how that works? If I had just these two images together, like that, they're close, but we'd end up with some weird artifacting happening. And let me try to point it out if I can. See right there? Let me switch cursors here. See how this doesn't line up, this image to this image? When Photoshop puts the mask on, that part goes away because it's pulled the image way over to here where the seams start to happen. So see how it's managed to make those two blend together. Let me enable the layer mask. So we can continue on with the rest of these images, and you can see how Photoshop has worked through these various pieces to align the images together for us. So the upper set is pretty easy. Lower set there, like that. You can see that I made a mistake and there's my arm in the photo, right? So that happens, but I could erase that or I could overlap it with another image as I started to shoot it. So it was a pretty painless process, but it's a good illustration of how these masks are done and what the mask can do for you. So when you're done with this image, you're going to do the same thing. You're going to go to File, Save for Web. You're probably going to get this warning that says it exceeds the size. Say yes anyway. And you can see that the image size is a lot larger because I combined multiple images together. This image, the main width is 8,000 pixels. We want to cut that down to 1,000. and then you'll be able to post that relatively easy on the course website. So there it is.
So why the two edges?
So these edges are because the way that the photos are distorted, once you unroll it flat, you're going to get that warp. Okay?
Trying to project it on the flat.
Right, because it's projecting on the flat. It's kind of like the inside of a sphere or an orange. When you go to peel the orange, you can't peel it flat. So you're going to stretch part of it if you're going to make it happen. So that's why we get these stretching effects down at the bottom. You don't have to throw, I obviously was careful about which images I picked. I could go up and do this process again, automate, Photomerge, you browse, and pick something different. We'll do the building courtyard here, and let me pick a few. I picked a different group. This group, the reason I picked this group was because they're not just a group that's going to make a square composition. So give it a second for this to apply together. And so in this context, fewer images, it's stitched faster. My groupings were such that I didn't get that square. I got a few random pieces. So if you overlap your images and they're not in a perfect circle, you might get a result that's something like this. It still is a perfectly effective wide-angle view. You're just controlling which part of the wide-angle view. So it doesn't have to be perfect. We just need to make sure that images are overlapping. So if I did the same thing, Photomerge, and I picked those. And I didn't pay too much attention while I was picking them. And I said, OK. You might get something like this, where these images overlapped. So I was able to stitch those. But then I had this image that Photoshop said, I don't know where this one came from. So I get it's sitting over here in the corner as its own image because Photoshop doesn't know what to do with it. So you do have to be careful about what you give Photoshop to get the desired results back. So just be aware of that. That process can mess you up a little bit too. Okay? So if I were to throw everything, you're more than welcome to try that. I'm not going to do it live because it takes too long. You can see what it does. The problem is when Photoshop tries to determine if it's a full 360, where should the seam go at the back? How do I know which piece is on which side? That's where Photoshop gets confused. So 180 will work great if you shot that. Okay, so the rest of the day today, I'm going to have you do those two parts. Okay, when you're done, you'll post the two images to the website. So one panorama that's stitched and one high dynamic range that has some modifications applied to it. If you want to apply some modifications to the panorama for practice, by all means do that as well. It's a little bit more challenging though because all of these are separate little layers. But if I did apply an adjustment layer, it will apply to everything below it. So let me say I want to do a levels adjustment, for example. This levels adjustment applies to the whole image. So if I made that adjustment, that applies to everything below it, not just the single image. So it'll still work. Your process will still work. And then you can work with the mask the same way. All right, so you'll post those. If you have any extra time today, go ahead and read through assignment 102. Maybe look through some of the examples online and just kind of get your brain thinking about it so you can have that in the back of your head this weekend when you're doing stuff to get some ideas out. Okay? Any other questions? Yeah?
It might be specific to this, but just wondering if you could do in the HDR, if you're going to just don't line up, do they have to line up perfectly for
the HDR prefers the images to line up closely. This one overlaps them, and the purpose is to overlap them. So it depends on how far off they are. I'll come and have a look, though. Okay? question individual or for everybody? Okay, I'll be there.